want to do what I can to address the theme of our gathering. Hope is on the horizon. There's a wonderful book entitled Restoring Hope by Cornel West. Cornel West, in this book, Restoring Hope, does a series of interviews with outstanding and profound prophetic, poetic personalities, one being Maya Angelou, the late, great Maya Angelou. In conversation with Dr. Angelou, Dr. West asked her to portray, as only she could, what hope looks like. Listen to her response as she provides us with what I call a hermeneutic of hope through the lens of an old Negro spiritual. In this old Negro spiritual, according to Maya Angelou, are these words: when it looked like the sun wasn't going to shine no more, God put a rainbow in the sky, or a rainbow, I should say, in the clouds. When it looked like the sun wasn't going to shine no more, God put a rainbow in the clouds. And then Maya goes on to share that whenever life is at its darkest, its dreariest, its worst, that's when we look into those clouds of the worst, and somehow we can see and sense hope. After all, a rainbow, listen to her interpretation, is simply a storm where the sun is shining. I like that. Maya Angelou says that God put a rainbow in the sky when it looked like the sun wasn't going to shine no more. But what is a rainbow but a storm that the sun is shining through? I like that because that particular hermeneutic of hope through the lens of that old Negro spiritual helps to inform our gathering today. Because Maya Angelou says that hope does not ignore the harsh existential realities. There are clouds, there are systems that are dark and threatening. I park here parenthetically because I think you know I'm from Texas. Texas, I consider right now a battleground where we are fighting fascism as we are fueled by hope. I live in Texas, where our state political representatives just emerged from what we call a special suppression session, where they produced, watch this, 666 laws, quite appropriate, I would say. 666 laws came out of this most recent session in Texas, and they are laws many of you are familiar with, at least two or three. Of course, reproductive justice is being threatened, not to mention voter suppression, voter restriction laws are being lifted. All of that came out of that particular session. Here's what's interesting is that Texas ranks, Lindsay, 37th in the country when it comes to poverty. It's worse when it comes to child poverty. Texas, my sisters and brothers, is the least insured state in this nation. And yet there, out of those 666 laws, not one of them addressed the plight of the poor. Not one of them dealt with the fact that we are the least insured nation. And so when Maya Angelou says that old Negro spiritual, when it looks like the sun wasn't going to shine no more, there are those of us in Texas who are wondering if the sun is ever going to shine because of these pernicious policies. And I park right there because understand that in Texas, we rank 37th in poverty, worse in child poverty. We are least insured, and yet out of 666 laws, none of them dealt with the plight of the impoverished. And it reminds us of the fact that when We are serious about dealing with poverty, serious about dealing with the plight of those who are poor. We must deal with systems. I've got to illustrate this idea. Several years ago, I was invited to share during the Freedom Fund banquet for the Bay Area. And so when I flew out from Dallas to San Francisco, my flight had been delayed. And so once I arrived, because I grew up in San Francisco, I rented a car and drove from the airport to the hotel where I had a reservation. And so I get to the hotel, and if you've been to San Francisco, you know it's a city that is built on 7 hills. It's a beautiful city in terms of its of the aesthetics. It's a gorgeous city, again, built on 7 hills. And the particular hotel that the NAACP had made this reservation for me was a hotel where, watch this, the top 4 floors were above ground, and the bottom 3 floors were beneath the ground, as it were. And so I check into the hotel, and I'll be very honest with you, the person at the desk, when she greeted me, evidently, had issues with the fact that I was staying in this hotel. Perhaps her neck was red, I'm not sure. But the bottom line is, I don't know if her name was Karen, I did not ask, but the bottom line is she had issues with me checking into this hotel, and she treated me accordingly. And so I tried to ignore it because I just wanted a room. My flight was late. I had to speak the next day for the Freedom Fund banquet. I needed time to finish up my message, and so I didn't really want to argue with her or talk about her horrific personality and lack of hospitality. So I wasn't going to have that conversation. And as a consequence, finally, she gave me my key to the room. She slammed it down on the desk. And instead of doing what is done in what is normally a 5-star hotel, I had seen her treat the person before me with the respect of coming around the desk and handing the key in a gentle and hospitable and welcoming fashion. But she slammed my key on the desk. And so, again, I'm not going to have this argument right now. I'm here to speak for the NAACP. I'm home. It's San Francisco, and so I'm not going to let her issues with me become an issue for me. I take the key and I go to the elevator, look at the contraption that the key was in that lets me know that my room was on the bottom floor. It's on the first floor, and so I have to go down to get to my room. And once I go into the room, I get ready for bed after unpacking, and then that's when I hear this loud clanging noise, a loud clanging noise that just disrupted what was supposed to be a peaceful rest. Immediately, I called the front desk, and of course, she answers the phone. When she answered the phone, I said, listen, there's a loud noise down here, and I need to change rooms. She says, we have no more rooms, and that's where the system puts you. And by then, I had taken all I could take from her. I promise you, I am an avid follower of Martin Luther King Jr., but Malcolm X was rising up in me at this time. And so when she said the system had put me on that bottom floor, I could take it no more. Now, let me kind of hang out right there because I think that's what we should have a discussion around. She said that the system had put me on that bottom floor. I think it's very important that we have a conversation about systems because if we're not careful, as faith leaders, we can spend a lot of time ignoring systems while engaging in service, and to ignore systems while engaging in service will, in essence, reinforce the systems that produce the necessity for service that you are engaging in. I hope I'm coming through right quick. I'm simply saying that this woman said to me that the system had placed me on the bottom floor. I want to suggest when we look at what's happening with poverty in what Maya Angelou calls these yet to be United States of America, America, there are systems that have placed some at the bottom. It's not accidental. If you don't believe it, read when you get a chance Richard Rothstein's wonderful work entitled Color of Law. In Color of Law, he explains brilliantly how this country literally has been set up. Segregation was not accidental. It was an intent of public policy that was set up. And we're not talking about Jim and Jane Crow segregation alone. We're talking about what's happening in Chicago today, what's happening in Dallas today, New York today. We're talking about residential segregation. David Williams of Harvard speaks of the fact that residential segregation lets us know that we live in a nation where your life expectancy is not determined by your genetic code, but by your zip code. And that zip code injustice is a product, again, Rothstein maintains, of what? Public policy. It's a product of systems that have placed some at the bottom. And when you are at the bottom, you find yourself wedded to, as it were, communities that are violated by environmental racism. I'm in Dallas, as you know, and so I will testify right quick that one of the victories that we are most proud of happened recently, but it was against an ugly backdrop, Dr. Mellett, an ugly backdrop of a zoning policy, a racist zoning policy, where one of the members of our church had right next door to her home was constructed, as it were, and I use the word construction loosely, and you'll understand when I share with you what was constructed. What was constructed next to her was a mountain of shingles from rooftops. We came to call it Shingle Mountain. Now, I'm not coming through because you would be aghast and ready to rise up in rebellion if you really got what I just said. I'm talking about shingles from rooftops were moved and placed in this area next to one of the members of our church. We called it Shingle Mountain. It was 10 stories high. I got to stop because I'm still not coming through. Not only is it 10 stories high, that 10-story high Shingle Mountain on our side of town in Dallas was the highest structure, as it were. No buildings, no high-rises, no high-rise condominiums, no high-rise office buildings. No, it was a 10-story Shingle Mountain. And the 10-story Shingle Mountain, of course, has resulted in our member now having in her 60s issues with breathing, lungs, as she's never had before. Why? Because environmental racism, that was the product of zoning policies that were racist. They exacerbated the fact that not only is she on a side of town characterized by economic neglect, but on a side of town where environmental racism is the norm. And so I'm suggesting that what do you do in a setting like that? Do you engage simply in what? Charity, where we go and give my member what? Asthma inhalers, free asthma inhalers? No. Our responsibility was to remove Shingle Mountain, and that's exactly what we did. We removed the mountain. I'm still not coming through. I think it's Reverend Jesse Jackson who puts it this way. He says, as faith leaders, watch this, as faith leaders, we are really good about denouncing sin within, but we are less proficient at denouncing and understanding and critiquing the sin we live in. Okay. Sin we live in. We can talk about sins within, but what about sin we live in? Injustice is a sin we live in. Oppression is a sin we live in. In a few weeks, you're going to have one of the great minds of our time, Brian Stevenson, here. I think that's going to be a powerful experience. He does a brilliant job of unpacking the criminal justice system as a sin we live in, because we live in a nation where it is far better, according to Stevenson, to be what? Rich and guilty than poor and innocent. That's a sin that we live in. Poverty is a sin that we live in. And so it's very important for us to understand what Dr. King was articulating when, according to Michael Eric Dyson, Dr. King had taken the movement from the South up north, and the focus was now on fighting impoverishment. And Dr. King is in Chicago, Dr. Thomas, and while in Chicago, he's leading a march against residential segregation and impoverishment. And while leading that march, someone spits on Dr. King. A brother from the west side of Chicago ain't playing that. Dr. Thomas can tell you the west side is a different side. And so when the brother saw that the drum major for peace and justice had been spat upon by a racist, that brother said, forget all this nonviolent stuff. I'm protecting Dr. King. Dr. King stopped him, and Dr. King stopped him with these words. He said, you are upset because you feel I've been disrespected by the spit that came from the mouth of that racist, but you are not upset about the systemic policies that have you paying more for less. You are not upset about the lack of services on your side of town. You are not upset about the fact that public policies have been spitting on you for quite some time. I hang out right there because that is what we've got to be concerned about as people of faith. And that is, if we're not careful, we will get caught up, watch this, in someone calling what? A black person the N-word, or a woman the B-word, instead of dealing with the policies that treat them like the N-word and the B-word. It's very important as persons of faith that we come to understand it's one thing to engage in niceties of charity that feed the poor. It's another thing when we decide to attack those systems that have created impoverishment. I can't think of the author's name, but I read recently something that blessed me. He talked about charity as opposed to fighting for justice is just like giving Rosa Parks a brand new car. You'll catch that in just a moment. Rosa Parks did not need a new car. Rosa Parks was in need of justice on the bus system there in Montgomery, Alabama. So how do we, in light of these clouds, because right now I'm simply painting a picture of dark, threatening clouds, and Lindsay told me that our conversation is going to be around hope on the horizon, and all I've done is given you how cloudy and dark and threatening the clouds are, and yet it is in the midst of those clouds, Maya Angelou says, that we can see a rainbow. We can see the sun shining through that storm. We can see it. How do we see it? We see it because of the mindset behind our gathering. We see it because the mindset behind our gathering, I believe, is reflected in a passage of scripture found in, and I promise you I'm not going to preach, but there's a passage of scripture found in the gospel according to Matthew, and the Bible lets us know that Jesus the Christ is engaged in a time of healing. His itinerant ministry has him healing and preaching and teaching in synagogues. And in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 and 38, the scripture lets us know that Jesus says these words, or Matthew records these words, as Jesus beholds the masses, and the text says they are harassed and helpless as sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus says we need some hustlers of hope, because what's going on right here is the harvest is plentiful, but we have a labor shortage. We need some hustlers of hope, because the hustlers of hope are going to help us to ensure that those sheep without a shepherd who are harassed, who are helpless, and I got to park right here because I knew I was going to be at CTS, and I've been going to school here, and I had to at least act like I've been learning something. As a matter of fact, I was blessed to have one of your professors as a Greek teacher for me, and she shared with us some profound lessons about Greek, and so I did my homework, and in doing my homework, look at the words in that passage, harassed and helpless. They both have to do with violence, and the word for harassed and the words for harassed and helpless reflect a violence that they are experiencing. But when you connect the dots, Jesus then refers to Ezekiel chapter 34, which is an indictment on political leadership. And so Jesus, in essence, is saying that the violence they are experiencing is at the hands of political leadership. You're not getting it, are you? The violence they are experiencing is at the hands of public policy. And that simply means that what Dr. King was saying was so right. And that is, don't just look at what you see as the blatant, evident physical violences and conclude that's the only expression of violence. Violence shows up in policies that preclude possibilities, that drown dreams. Violence shows up when people find themselves impoverished, because whatever else I've discovered about poverty, poverty means my options are limited. And oftentimes we are guilty of judging persons in poverty for their choices, but we do nothing about their options. And so what does Jesus share with us that gives us hope on the horizon? Hope on the horizon for me, as I reflect on this and even the ministry of Jesus, hope on the horizon lets us know that we have a responsibility, and I think I've been trying to push this, as the embodiment of hope, to not just settle for charity, but to always fight for justice. Don't settle for charity. Charity will comfort your conscience and make you feel good that you're doing something good for those who are not as well off as you. But charity is a sprint race. Justice is a marathon fight. Charity and justice. And so Jesus here is talking about the sheep victimized by violence at the hands of political leadership. And so it's one thing to feed the hungry, it's another thing to fight hunger. I got to see if I can make this as clear as possible. Again, I'm trying not to preach, but there's a lot of preaching in this. And so charity makes me feel good right now. But justice is a long-term fight, and that long-term fight of justice is one where, so I'll do it like this. Jesus, toward the end of his ministry, does something that is quite interesting, and I love it because it's an indictment on policies, and we often overlook it. Jesus says in the judgment, I'm going to separate the nations, and the sheep will go here and the goats will go there. And I'm going to say, I was hungry, I was thirsty. You know what Jesus says. And I could Freddie Haynes remix it for this country and say, I was hungry and you cut aid to dependent children. I was thirsty and you contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. I was a stranger and you tried to build a wall. I was in prison because of your prison industrial complex and the new Jim Crow. And America's going to say, Lord, when did we do this? And as much as you did it to the least of these, you did it also unto me. Here's what's interesting. Jesus, Zan Wesley Holmes says, separates the nations. He separates the nations. We often think of this in individual terms, but the text says he separates nations. When he separates nations, he then indicts the nations or judges the nations based on how they treated those who were hungry, those who were what? Foreigners, as it were, those who were in prison. And so what is he talking about here? If you're indicting nations, then you're dealing with policies. And if you're dealing with policies, that means that we must recognize our responsibility is, again, not just to minister to individuals, but to deal with the systems that those individuals find themselves messed over by, influenced, infected by. It's systemic injustice that we've got to deal with. And so what Jesus is saying right here in this passage that is so profound, don't settle for charity. Make sure you deal with issues of systemic injustice. The story is told about, and it's a powerful story about a young preacher who had been assigned to a church, and this church was situated at the bottom of a wonderful, beautiful hill. And this church, before he came, had discovered that there was at the bottom of this hill that was this church, but the church at the bottom of the hill found itself situated at the bottom of that hill, but there was a winding, meandering road that went around that hill from top to bottom. And so as a consequence, there were a number of car accidents, and the church decided, here's what we're going to do. We are going to buy what? An ambulance. And when we buy this ambulance this way, we are going to rescue the perishing and care for the dying. And they sang that Sunday after Sunday, rescue the perishing, care for the dying, proud that whenever a car accident took place, they could rush their ambulance, and the ambulance would rush the perishing, dying to the hospital, hoping to save them. When the new preacher came to town, the new preacher said, that is a really beautiful thing that you have the ambulance, but how many of you will join me on Wednesday and go downtown to City Hall and petition the city to build guardrails along those winding, meandering roads? Let's go downtown and petition to build guardrails so that we will not have accidents where the ambulance is a necessity. Do you know they got upset with that young preacher, put him out of the church because they were pleased to engage in a what? Ambulance service, but they did not want to engage in the fight for ensuring that guardrails were put in place so that they could preclude what was happening from taking place. That is what we have to be about if we call ourselves persons of faith. And that is, if faith without works is dead, then we have a responsibility not just to feed the hungry, but to fight systems that create hunger. How do we do that? And I'm done. We do it by, again, embodying hope. And when we embody hope, our embodiment of hope means that when we feed the hungry, we don't limit what we do to simply that meal right there, but going behind the systems and policies that create their limited options and the choices that are narrowing. And that is our challenge. I close with this because I'm sure some of you are wondering, okay, you forgot to tell us what happened at the hotel in San Francisco. And so one of the reasons that you have been sitting there is because your heart went out to me and you've been saying, well, what happened to you? Did you end up staying on the bottom floor at that hotel in San Francisco? Let me set you free so you can go ahead and shout. Here's what happened. I called up to the front desk. Of course, I guess her name was Karen. She acted like she was Karen. Karen Karen said, the system puts you on the bottom floor. And then as soon as I hung up the phone, I decided, Malcolm, head upstairs. I go to the elevator to get upstairs. And once I got to the front desk, I asked for Karen. Do you know she had just gotten off work? And so my attitude has not settled. And so I said, well, give me the person in charge, and they told me that the person in charge was in the back, and so they went to get the night manager. When they got the night manager, Dr. Thomas, he comes out, and when he comes out, he looks at me and he says, you look familiar. I said, okay. I said, I'm on the first floor, the bottom floor. I need to get off the bottom floor because I'm speaking for the NAACP tomorrow. And he looks at the computer, sees my name. He says, are you Fredrick Douglass Haynes III, the son of Frederick Douglass Haynes Jr.? I don't feel like being recognized. All I want is to get off that first floor. And he says, you're the son of the late Reverend F.D. Haynes Jr.? I said, yes, sir. I said, can you please get me out of that room on the bottom floor? He said, hold on. You are the son of my late pastor, Frederick Douglass Haynes Jr. I said, if that's who you need me to be right now to get me off of this bottom floor, I'll be whoever you need me to be. He says, I'm being very serious right now because you have no idea what your dad did for me at a very low moment in my life where I was about to kill myself. Something led, and you know what the something was, your dad to call me up in the aftermath of the death of my mother and father who had died 2 days apart. Your dad called me. I was getting ready to kill myself, and your dad stayed with me and stuck with me until I got counseling, and now I'm doing as well as I'm doing because your dad helped me. And so I said, I'm so glad that my father could help you. He said, I did not say that your dad helped me. Your dad hoped me. There's a difference between helping and hoping. Your dad did not help me. Your dad did more than helping me. Your dad hoped me because your dad hung with me during the darkest time of my life and let me know there was more to my life than what I was about to do, that I did not have to end life. And so as a consequence, your dad hoped me. And then he said, now, what is your problem? I said, I'm on the bottom floor because your Karen told me that the system had placed me there. He said, well, because of what your dad did for me, because your dad hoped me, we're going to overdrive this system and see what else we have left here. I'm not bragging, I'm testifying. There was one room left in that hotel, not on the bottom floor, on the top floor, not a king room, but a king suite. And y'all, I got upgraded from the bottom floor to the top floor. I'm in a suite. Why? Because my dad had hoped one who was able to override the system. Now I'm about to shout, but I got to bring this thing down because I got to preach in chapel, and this ain't the preaching moment. This is the keynote moment. But I'm going to let you know right now that if we embody hope, and that is what we do as we engage in ministry to those who find themselves on the margins, if we do that, then we will hope them. But our hoping them has everything to do with overturning unjust systems that create poverty, overturning unjust educational systems, a criminal justice system, in zoning regulations that create environmental racism. All of those are systems that we must fight to overturn because those systems always have a way of targeting communities of color with a particularity. If we overturn those systems, the good news is they will say about us, as that man said about my daddy, you hoped me. Let's leave this place determined to ensure that those who struggle right now with impoverishment can say about faith leaders all throughout this nation and right here in Indiana, you hoped me. God bless you.